You're listening to Indications by the Conference Board.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Indications. My name is Bart van Ark and I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and today we're going to speak about the Conference Board Global Consumer Confidence Index, which we produce in collaboration with Nielsen. It's a very exciting index. It covers 64 countries, where in each country we survey 500 households through the internet. So that means that in total we're tracking about 32,000 households around the world. So it's a great survey that gives us insights around consumer sentiment, and the index has a couple of sub-questions. The three main sub-questions going into it are the sentiment of consumers with regard to their job prospects, their sentiment with regard to their personal income situation or their personal finance situation, and finally their spending intentions. So we're going to speak about that. We're going to talk first about what is this index exactly. We then give you a high-level overview of the findings for the first quarter of 2019 and how that compares over time and what it means for economic growth. And then finally, we will learn a little bit more about what does it actually mean for consumer behavior in the next 12 months or so. And for that, I'm being joined by my colleague, Denise Dahlhoff. She's senior researcher on consumer research at the Conference Board. Denise, welcome, and fun to do this together.
Thanks, great to be here.
Well, let's start with perhaps the hard stuff, but I think it's important for our listeners to really understand what this index exactly is. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about what we're talking about beyond what I just mentioned.
Sure. So this is an online survey, as Bart mentioned. We do this every quarter in 64 countries around the world. It's an online sample. It is representative for that online population in each country. We actually weigh it by age and gender. And we pick those countries based on the online usage penetration in each country. So we want 60% of the population being online, or 10 million online users. And as Bart mentioned, the index actually is composed of three different sub-questions, and they are, key economic sort of variables that determine consumer behavior. And they are consumers' job prospects over the next 12 months, their perception of their personal finances over the next 12 months, and how good they think a time it is right now to spend on goods or services. And so based on these, on consumers' sentiments about these three variables, they have four response options, and they can answer excellent, good, not so good, or bad. And based on these four different options, we assign scores from 0 to 200. Bad would be 0, excellent would be 200, and the middle of that is 100, and that's exactly the intermediate point between good and not so good. So any index value above 100, we consider optimistic.
So that's perhaps important to consider, because some people may ask, what is the base of the index? Is it based on 100 in 2005 when the index started? But this is not the case. Basically, for every quarter, we're just looking at whether there are more optimistic or more pessimistic consumers. If they are above 100, we have more optimistic consumers. If they're below 100, we have more pessimistic consumers, right?
That's correct. That's exactly right. And that also brings up the question, can you compare can you make comparisons across countries? And so that's a little bit tricky because, first of all, these are, of course, subjective responses, how people feel. And there are cultural differences. Some cultures are just genuinely more enthusiastic. And, if you ask them about a certain situation, they might think, it's fantastic. Another culture would call it, yeah, it's okay. So there are cultural differences, but also structural differences in each country. For example, the social welfare system might be very different, which might influence responses to how people feel about their personal finances, for example. So really the value of the index, our quarterly findings and data, the best way is to compare it per country over time and look at trends.
Yeah, I think a good example that I heard is we actually see when you look at the index that consumers in India are always way above 100. They're very optimistic. They're a bit bullish on the economy. whereas consumers in South Korea or Japan are always below 100. And one of my colleagues once told me and said, well, if consumers in South Korea would go up to 100, that would be a really big deal in terms of optimism. Whereas if consumers in India would come down to 100, it would actually be really bad news. So I think that's the way to think about it, right?
Yeah, for sure. And we can probably lump in Europe into that category that tends to be on the more pessimistic side, although, Europe is not a country that is doing poorly, but, that's consumers' perception and how they feel about the situation.
Okay, I guess by now listeners will know, okay, and what was the results for the first quarter of 2019? Well, good news. The first quarter of 2019, the index was still above 100. Actually, it was at 106 globally for all global consumers. That was just 1 point down from the last quarter of 2018 when it was 107. But that really is a very small change. So it's actually, frankly, not very significant. What is also very important is that consumers are still at historically high levels. This index started in 2005, and the last quarter of 2018 is when we saw the highest level of 107. So yes, it has slowed a little. It has perhaps even peaked, if we could use that terminology. But because consumers are still pretty high level in terms of their optimism, we're not too concerned about the immediate implications for the economy. Now, there are, of course, differences. There is nothing like a global consumer. So we definitely see that, particularly North America and Asia Pacific, they house the most optimistic consumers. So that's where you see the most bullish behavior. Whereas in Europe, for example, or in Latin America, consumers typically tend to be a little bit more pessimistic. And even, by the way, in Asia Pacific, the mature economies like Japan, Korea, Australia, we actually see that consumers are somewhat less optimistic. So I think that is an important distinction to make. The other important distinction is between the change, even though the overall index came down by 1 point, when we look at the emerging markets, on the whole, the number is still up. That's true for Asia Pacific, and that's certainly also true for Latin America. Whereas in the case of Europe, it went actually down a little bit. In the case of the euro area and in the case of the United States, it sort of remained unchanged, but there was really no development. So as I said, it's sort of, it's basically peaked. And the implication of that for the economy, frankly, is that, we think that consumer growth will continue to be pretty important in the next couple of months. We don't really expect that there will be an imminent pullback, unless, of course, we get some unpredicted shock. And, consumers are sensitive to shock. So that is something that we need to watch carefully. So that at a very high level are the most important insights. Denise, anything to add to that?
So in addition to asking consumers about how they feel about these three components, we have additional questions that are asking consumers about whether they feel their country is in a recession, whether they have cut back on spending, what their plans are in terms of spending discretionary money that they have. And to Bart's overview of the findings, actually the question about recession sentiment in somebody's country is actually pretty consistent with that. So, for example, we see that in the U.S., actually North America has the lowest perception of being in a recession. Europe, on the other hand, recession sentiment has actually gone up, and in the other regions, it has actually declined. So those regions, Asia Pacific, Latin America, and Middle East and Africa, have felt much better, meaning like not feeling as much in a recession. And another question we ask is about what's top of mind for consumers in terms of their concerns. And typically what we see is like the economy is always, it tends to be in number one, followed by job security, health, and also work-life balance questions. Interestingly, in North America, this is a little bit different. Like there are a couple of additional components that have floated to the top, and they are debt and also immigration. Immigration has actually become a top one concern for consumers over the last several quarters.
Wow. So yeah, there's a lot of rich detail in there. And obviously this is going to be hard for listeners to all sort of pull together. So I do recommend, if you really want to figure this out by country and things, just go to our website, conferenceboard.org or conference-board.org. and then go to Global Consumer Confidence Index, and then you can find all the details, some really good heat maps and charts from which you can gather some further insights and some further analysis. So Denise, we talked about countries, we talked about some of the special questions, but let's take a little bit more of a deep dive into those three components that we were talking about: job prospects, personal finance situation, and intentions to spend. And when we look sort of at the global picture, there's actually not a lot of movement. It stays pretty much the same on all those three components. But when you're going to look at each of the sort of four main regions, North America, Asia Pacific, Europe, and Latin America, there's actually some difference. We find, for example, that on job prospects, Europeans and Latin Americans tend to be a little bit more concerned than North Americans and those in Asia Pacific. We also find that, when it comes to personal finance situation, there's a bit more concern also in Europe that has gone up a little bit. But I think most of the movement probably is in spending intentions. There we actually see some more concern in North America even. Also in the case of Europe, it stayed about the same in Asia Pacific, and it even went down a little bit in Latin America. So that I think is the area where we see the clearest difference between the mature economies and the emerging markets, where the mature economies are a little bit softer on their spending intentions, and the emerging markets still seem to be, unchanged or even up, as in the case of Latin America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and spending intentions of those three questions, of course, that ask about, specific, taking action, like spending money, and so, we definitely see more variation there. And, we also have to keep in mind that we are asking about intentions, and this is self-reported. Consumers look to the future, and they can only give their best estimate. However, that doesn't mean it will be their actual behavior. And of course, what comes between, your intentions and what you actually end up doing, there are many factors, but one key piece of that is, of course, companies' marketing activities. So to the offering, the product and service offering that companies have, the pricing, as well as the messaging that they use and the distribution channels. So, this is just a really good proxy for what we expect to go on with consumers in those markets, but definitely important to track actual spending in the future.
So what are some of the sort of top categories you need to look at if we drill a little bit deeper on these spending intentions? You've, of course, got sort of durable consumer goods, non-durable consumer goods. What kind of distinctions would you want to make here?
Yeah, so this is, we have one question where we ask consumers, when you have some extra money, what do you spend it on? And, the number one category is actually not spending it, but number one is saving, saving your money. Number two is typically, vacations, holidays, and then also, new clothes, out-of-home entertainment, meaning eating out, going to shows, and also new tech products. So that's typically, the ranking that we see. We have seen, with, a slight softening in consumer sentiment, we have seen mostly a downward trend. Of course, that varies by market. But there are some exceptions. For example, for holidays, we have seen that in Spain, Portugal, and Switzerland and Japan, for example, the intentions to spend on those categories have actually increased. And
more
then
time
also,
to go on vacation, I guess.
Yes.
Yeah.
And in the US, for example, the intention to buy tech products has increased, as well as clothes, which is actually contrary to other regions. And a market like Portugal, which is still in the pessimistic area, however, it has trended upward, and we have seen that intentions to spend on these categories has actually gone up along with that.
So there's a lot of detail here, and that's sort of what's really nice about this index. And again, I would recommend people go to our website, conference-board.org, and go to Global Consumer Confidence, and you find a lot of that detail. My question to you now is, how should companies, our member companies and other companies, use this kind of material beyond just asking a marketing company to do a good marketing survey for them? What can they learn from this kind of data on consumer confidence?
Yeah, this is actually a unique data set that companies typically don't collect. So it provides a lot of useful information. For example, for multinational companies, when they look at our what we call the heat map around the world of consumer sentiment to craft their strategies, what markets they want to invest in or, be more present in. It also helps to tweak your marketing strategies if like consumer sentiment is going down in one of the markets. Maybe you have to adjust your product assortment to offer products that cater more to a value-based or value-oriented consumer, or you might tweak your pricing strategies. And also now with the availability of online channels and platforms, you don't have to necessarily be present in a country. So, for example, if you see some of these smaller markets trending upward in consumer sentiment, you can take advantage of that without, opening an office there or a distribution center. You can use platforms in those countries, for example. And it's also important to keep in mind, when consumers don't feel so great anymore about the economy, it doesn't mean they stop spending. So it's more a matter of, really understanding consumers and catering to their needs and wants. And so, for example, when times get a little tougher, consumers typically look for more value. They also look for, little indulgences like affordable luxuries. Like there's the famous lipstick, effect or indicator where people buy like little, items that make them happy. In the last recession, for example, it wasn't lipsticks as much, but more nail polish. Mm-hmm. That became the new affordable luxury. Mm-hmm. And also products and services that give people comfort, like anything, brands that you're familiar with, any messaging around, security and safety and, well-being, like all those kinds of messages, work well in those times. And, in Asia Pacific, actually, the consumer sentiment is, as Bart mentioned, is really high, and also, spending intentions look pretty good. So that should continue to be a really attractive market for luxury as well. So there are many things here that companies can use and digest, and also learn over time. Working with the data and seeing how their sales in certain markets actually develop.
Excellent. Well, very good. So in sum, the index is down just a little bit, but still at historical highs around 106. We have more optimistic consumers in the world than pessimistic consumers. That means that, at least for the time being, we're not concerned about a pullback on consumption. We expect consumption growth to remain solid. Let's hope that there will nothing be like a major shock. Let's hope we get the trade deals done. Let's hope that Brexit is sort of pursuing smoothly and not with too many shocks. But then we think that so far, so good as far as the consumer in 2019 is concerned. And then again, for consumer goods industries, lots of areas where you can continue to build. Take a deeper dive at these numbers. Look at conference-board.org. Go to our Global Consumer Confidence Index webpage. By mid-May, we'll have a full report in addition to the summary that is right out there for the world. We'll have some specific detail for Asia Pacific and for Europe later in May. And then, of course, the next index is going to be released for the second quarter of 2019, and that's going to be on July 3rd, 2019. Denise, thanks for joining, and we hope the listeners have benefited from this podcast by the Conference Board.
This has been Indications from the Conference Board.